President Trump's major announcement today being watched all over the world, pulling the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal and imposing tough new sanctions on Iran instead.
Under the Iran nuclear deal, Iran agreed to shut down its production of weapons-grade uranium and allowed regular inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which says Iran has stuck by its side of the deal. Hassan Rouhani announcing he has ordered Iran scientists to prepare to start enriching uranium again if necessary.
Well, in the wake of Trump's decision to unilaterally withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal, the world stands divided like never before. The U.S. will resume its economic sanctions on Tehran, but the remaining members of the original pact are urging Iran to remain in the deal, hoping to avoid a war that many suspect is now beginning to unfold.
This is already a volatile region, and in a reminder today, Israel fired missiles into Syria.
Air raids sounding in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Rockets fired
from Military says it responded after 20 rockets were fired at its...
Simmering hostility flared to life last night as the Israelis blasted Iranian fighters in Syria with their largest airstrike since the 1973 war.
On Tuesday, it blamed Israel for this airstrike. The Syrian military says this video shows it firing missiles in response to Israeli attacks on Damascus suburbs.
Syrian state media said Syrian air defenses had intercepted most of the incoming rockets over the capital Damascus, but also confirmed that a radar station and a weapons storage site were struck.
Rockets arching from one country to another, Israelis in the Golan Heights.
The two sides have exchanged hostile rhetoric for years, but now there are signs of an open military conflict.
That was followed by direct confrontation between Israel and Iran and Syria, and all comes ahead of next Monday's decision by Trump to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the date chosen to coincide with the 70th anniversary of Israel. In the build-up, we've witnessed another Friday of protest at Israel's border with Gaza, which brings us to the essential question. With all that's going on, can Israel afford to stick with the status quo when it comes to the Palestinians? A status quo that hasn't budged since the Oslo Accords. That was a quarter century ago.
Bigger next week, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel, when the US will move its embassy to Jerusalem. That's been condemned by Palestinians who hope that East Jerusalem will one day be their capital.
As Israelis and Palestinians both claim it as their capital.
Well, they also have a claim on Jerusalem. Of course, the basic problem is that Jews and Palestinians are, in fact, living with rival claims for the entire territory, what the British used to call Palestine, from the Mediterranean all the way to the Jordan River. So Israel was founded exactly 70 years ago.
But first, on May 14th, Israel will mark the 70th anniversary of its independence. The next day, Palestinians will mark Nakba Day, which means catastrophe in Arabic and commemorates the expulsion of over 700,000 Palestinians from their homes.
So Israel was founded exactly 70 years ago. The Palestinians never had an independent state. Egypt held the Gaza Strip. Jordan had the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israel got out of the Gaza Strip, by the way, in 2005 and says the only result was violence. As Palestinians have been angry, they felt ignored. And now President Trump decides to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and declare that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. The Palestinians say, what about us? What about our legitimate claim?
May 14th, 1948, the British mandate in Palestine is about to expire. David Ben-Gurion proclaims the birth of the State of Israel. The next day, the 5 neighboring Arab countries declare war.
The city of Haifa and its harbor become the center of bitter conflict as the new Jewish state is born in the tense atmosphere of civil war.
During the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, more than 700,000 Palestinians are forced into exile. It's the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic.
Haganah forces seek out every Arab, and barricades are set up to screen those who had not already fled the city. Everyone is searched.
The Haganah, a paramilitary organization, forms the core of Israeli forces and is responsible for expelling Palestinians. Their lands and houses are seized. Most flee to Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, or Syria. On December 11, 1948, the United Nations adopts a resolution for the right of return for these Palestinian refugees, but Israel has never given its permission. 70 years later, Ibrahim Mahmoud still lives in the Jalazon camp north of Ramallah.
But what it really says to me is that was a film very much made from a Palestinian point of view, showing a narrative of all the struggles they have every day, and it shows you the intense penury that people are living in and the intense difficulty they will have to get the type of political representation to make a real legitimate engagement with Israel. But on the other hand, Israel has no real desire to engage. As Gil said, the status quo as it stands has favored Israel at every step, and in recent years that's only been strengthened. And since Trump has come into office, it's only really the cards have been ever more stacked in Israel's favor.
منذ 20 أو 25 عام منذ توقيع اتفاقية أوسلو حتى اليوم تضاعف عدد المستوطنين الذين يقولون الضفة الغربية 7 أضعاف. لا يمكن أن يكون هناك قيام لكيان فلسطيني متماسك الأطراف أو متواصل جغرافيا. هذا يعني زمان انتهينا منه. الآن الأمور أحبابنا كتل استيطانية سرطانية حقيقة. ماذا تفعل؟ تقسم المدن الفلسطينية، تقسم شمال الضفة عن جنوب الضفة عن وسط الضفة الغربية. كيف نخلي الناس تثبت في أرضها؟ مجرد وجودك في هذه الأرض، مجرد وجودك، ذهابك إلى جامعتك، إلى مدرستك، إلى عملك، إلى منزلك، هو في هذه المرحلة يعني إنجاز كبير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. تدعوكم القوى الوطنية والإسلامية الآن في مسيرة من باب جامع حمزة إلى بيت إيد. قولوا لرئيس الأركان، قولوا لرئيس الأركان والحكومة الفاشية، والحكومة الفاشية. شعبي ثورة الوطن بدل وهوية، بدل وهوية. ما حدا يرجع، ما حدا يرجع، مش مكسرين.
In perhaps the harshest words so far, a senior Iranian cleric said Israeli cities face destruction if that country continues to act, quote, foolishly. During a Friday sermon at Tehran University, Ayatollah Ahmad Khatami had this warning after strikes on what Israel says were Iranian targets in Syria.
We will expand our missile capabilities despite Western pressure to curb it, to let Israel know that if it acts foolishly, Tel Aviv and Haifa will be totally destroyed.
Donald Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal has sparked a wave of protests in Tehran. Furious demonstrators burned the Stars and Stripes and photos of the US president.
Iranian leaders know the nuclear deal is on borrowed time. And there is mounting public pressure at home, as well as deep internal divisions among Iran's political heavyweights. All this could mean that an international agreement, years in the making, something that represented a hard-won diplomatic victory for Iran, is now beyond repair.
And so for several years now, Iran's been building up its forces inside Syria because of this civil war in Syria since 2011. So Iran has its bases there. They have people helping President Assad's government in Syria. Israel kept warning, don't get close to the border, don't build up so much. And finally, it's erupted.
A day later, a different tone from the Russian foreign minister.
We see this as a very alarming development.
And I add, the tensions are not just limited to the Golan Heights and the border between Israel and Syria. There is a lot of other friction in the region.
Cockpit video from Israeli warplanes as they carried out the largest and most prolonged airstrike in Syria since the start of its civil war. Israel says it hit dozens of Iranian military targets, as well as 5 Syrian anti-aircraft installations.
Including in Yemen, and the Saudis also seem to be moving in a direction of escalating by trying to take over the port of Hodeidah, which could also have a similar escalation and could easily spiral out of control there as well.
There was even a similar protest inside the country's parliament itself. MPs burned the US flag right there in the chamber with vocal support from fellow lawmakers.
Conservative lawmakers this morning burned a paper US flag in the parliament and chanted the familiar "Death to America."
The European Union is determined to preserve it. We expect the rest of the international community to continue to do its part to guarantee that it continues to be fully implemented, for the sake of our own collective security. Together with the rest of the international community, we will preserve this nuclear deal.
Well, besides Trump, one of those most in favour of scrapping the nuclear agreement has been the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who, as we heard earlier, is currently in Moscow.
Tell the story of an overnight Mideast confrontation.
The confrontation between Iran and Israel now threatening to expand. Israel's defense minister warned Iran any aggression will be met with overwhelming force. If we get rain, they will get a flood, he said.
I think really what it says to me is that when you look at, we're talking about an anniversary of 70 years, whatever time frame you cut it, you slice and dice it over, Israel is really looking in a very comfortable and strong position. It's there's no Palestinian state. It controls 60% of the West Bank. That area C you talk about is about 60% of the territory of the West Bank. The Palestinians' economy is extremely dependent. Well, it struggles anyway, but I mean, around almost 100,000 Palestinians try to leave the West Bank to enter Israel each day to work. And that's what we saw at the beginning of that film.
By the way, the Trump administration says we're not saying anything about that. Please enter negotiations. Maybe Jerusalem can be capital of 2 independent states.
On the Tel Aviv beachfront, there's a museum incorporating the ruins of a Palestinian building. The dedication says, "In memory of the liberators of the city." Eitan Bronstein works for an NGO which helps Israelis to learn Palestinian history.
Bonjour. Instead of saying that they're conquered, they liberated Jaffa. So they liberated, of course, from the Arabs, like they took it from the Arabs, and now they liberate it for the Jews.
He claims this rewrites history. The right of return is one of the main Palestinian demands, but it's unacceptable to most Israelis. In the Centre for the Heritage of the Jews of Egypt, Bronstein meets Shmuel Trigano. He makes the point that Jews living in Arab countries were also expelled from there.
Here, for instance, we have a scale model of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo.
On the issue of the right of return, the tone gets heated.
The fact that there have been Palestinian refugees, nobody questions that. But do they remain refugees from father to son? I don't think so.
For me, it's a weird argument because, in fact, the ones that keep the refugee situation of the Palestinians is Israel. Israel is not allowing them to return. Israel expelled them in the
because they want to destruct him. They want to destruct Israel, the state of Israel. That's the question.
No. They want to return home.
Hear what the Hamas is saying.
No. They want to return home. They want to return home.
According to the United Nations, there are more than 4 million Palestinians eligible to return. That worries Shmuel Trigano.
It would be a radical demographic change that would transform the state of Israel's very nature. There are no examples of democracy within the Arabo-Muslim world. The simple observation of the political situations in Israel's neighboring countries is enough for us to reject that idea. This would be a national suicide.
It's a good example for the impossibility of any future of peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
The two men part in deep disagreement.
That this clears the way for future talks. It's now clear Jerusalem has been the historic capital of the Jewish people.
I want to ask you, Christopher Dickey, about the timing of all of this. The way events have unfolded within the last 7-day time period, having the President of the United States walking away from the Iran deal, and then on the day where Israel celebrates its 70th anniversary is the day where you have the ceremony for moving the embassy.
But the founding of Israel as the national home for the Jews brought that hatred to kind of new levels with new players. I mean, we have to understand that Jews had been living in Palestine for 50 to 100 years before that. But when the UN said we need to declare this as a separate state within separate borders, suddenly it gave rise to armed conflicts that 200 million Arabs rose up in arms against 200,000 Israelis. And we've seen ever since, from the Palestinians to Hamas to Hezbollah to Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Turkey, Iran, Yemen, Somalia, and the list goes on and on and on. There has been an increasing, intensified hatred. One of the things that becomes really abundantly clear is that Israel, and Jerusalem in particular, play a very important role, a special role.
North Korea is denouncing a new American nuclear strategy that calls for the U.S. to enhance its arsenal of low-yield nuclear weapons. A spokesperson for the North Foreign Ministry's Institute of American Studies says the U.S. strategy is a declaration of war against the world.
As part of our defense, we must modernize and rebuild our nuclear arsenal, hopefully never having to use it, but making it so strong and so powerful that it will deter any acts of aggression by any other nation or anyone else. Perhaps someday in the future there will be a magical moment when the countries of the world will get together to eliminate their nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we are not there yet.